Thank you very much. Good morning again. Being Taylor and Charlie, you know, one can say that our experiences in the South African area correspond completely to what we've heard so far. So, in a sense, one will in fact cover the evolution of the fishery there and some of the figures that we've seen. And let's start right off with where we are, pretty much about as far away as we possibly could be from any nearest point. The steaming time is something of the order of 6 days down to Prince Edward and Marion Island, where the South Africans have the normal EEZ. And it's an area that was very, very intensively fished in the early 90s, since it received a great deal of attention from people that were withdrawing from other fisheries. Here we are. We had nimble poachers. We had slow officials. Those figures give some sort of idea of the initial impact of the poaching activities, which was enormous. Denzel Miller estimated somewhere between 25 and 30,000 tons came out of that fishery. And considering today that we're looking at models based on pristine of 25,000 tons, I think we're being a little bit conservative about what the fishery potentially can do. The figures, as you can see, fade away to pretty much much smaller figures in more recent past. Here's some figures showing the quotas versus catches over the years. What is particularly interesting, there were 5 companies or groups that were originally identified to participate in this fishery starting in 1996. And very shortly thereafter, many of the IUU fishers, in fact, moved out for one reason or another. And what did happen was that as of the beginning of this century, you can see that we set the quotas at levels which were not, in fact, fished. And the reason was that of the 5 companies, only one has, in fact, been operating continuously right through the entire time from 1995 or 1996 until today. So the figures that you see there for many of the years, in fact, only involved one vessel. And that vessel was also catching in the South Georgia fishery, so there was a limited amount of exposure that it could have, in fact, to the Prince Edward and Marion Island fishery. We, in fact, were in South Georgia during the South Georgia season, and that took us into the winter months and away from the South African area during the winter months when our experience had been we normally saw the whales. You'll notice that in the more recent years, the amount of fish caught was much closer to the quota, and that was because from about 2010 on, a second vessel operated in the South African area, and obviously performance improved there quite dramatically. And you'll also see that of late, the total allowable catch has been raised to 575 tons, where it is today. The assessments are always based on a CPUE basis, which, as you know, is not always ideal, but there's been extensive tagging for the last 5 years, and to date, I think we're getting up to 30 tags having come back, and the assessment now is including tagging information. The good news is that it conforms very closely to what we learned from the CPUE inputs. In order to avoid the whales that first made their presence known towards the end of the 20th century, there was an attempt made to introduce pot fishing on a big scale in 2004 and 2005. And you will see there that the figures for the catch of the pot fishing were pretty good, but you lost an enormous amount of gear, and there was an enormous amount of input that went in. So as an option, pot fishing actually was discarded. You also notice that as of about 2008, 2009, we also moved towards using cutulateras, which provided a considerable improvement over what we'd had as far as whale depredation was concerned. And there was also during that time an experiment run to find an index between the catching with the trot line and catching with the Spanish line, because being on a CPUE basis, we needed to have some kind of common figures running all the way through. The size distributions have hardly changed over the years in our fisheries, which is quite interesting. I suppose in a certain way it's a good sign. It also, however, relates to the type of bottom topography that we have in our area, which consists basically of scattered shallow areas. And what the boats very often do is to go to an area, fish it down to a certain point, and then move on. As far as whale depredation is concerned, our experience has been absolutely in line with what we've heard before. One can, in fact, add very, very little. Where the whales are present, we have been told by the skippers that, in fact, they very often take all the fish. And as an average, where whales are present, they believe that when they have orcas in the area, they lose 2/3 of the fish, and they then have to move. So while the CPUE figures over the years have remained, in a sense, reasonably constant, the amount of disturbance that the whales cause to the fishing operation is absolutely enormous. The bottom line is that for the assessment process, we take into account about a 10% loss by the whales. That figure, however, is a little bit flaky. For the last 5 years, the observers have collected a fair amount of data. We had hoped to present this today, but the scientists are still crunching the numbers, so we won't present you at the moment with anything that hasn't been verified in a sense. But there is extensive research and cooperation. Paul will no doubt go into some of that later. We have one sensor out there attached to a whale at the moment, giving very interesting information, of course, about the movement and exactly what's happening. And we are hoping that in this year now, we will have 3 sensors there. We've been kind enough to be lent a very good camera in order to provide identification of whales, and once more I think Paul might be able to give some additional scientific background and information into that. Our observers have been recording probably what everybody else has been doing so far. So once again, there's a database here which similarly to some of the other fisheries needs to be processed, needs to be used. And of course, most importantly, we are hoping that the sensor technology takes us to a place where we won't have to confront the animals anymore, and we can avoid trouble and not have the difficulties that we have today. The difference between the observer inputs we're getting and the inputs that we're getting from the skippers is quite interesting as well. We used to have only 1 observer on board the vessel. Now we're required to have 2, and that has resulted in more whales being spotted relative to what the fishing masters have told us. So those 2 figures seem to be in accordance, and we do have internal reports of whale sightings going back probably to about 2001, 2002. And if someone's very cute with the mathematics, they might be able to bring that into the models. Thank you very much indeed.